Hello, everyone. This is David Aguilar. I'm recording this lecture Tuesday night in preparation for your reading and discussion board assignment this week. To get you kind of started, I want to provide some context for the reading, which is the Declaration of Independence. It should be a reading you should be familiar with. You've probably read it in high school or middle school at some point. If you haven't read it, it's not a very hard read. It should be pretty easy to do. But what I think you'll need is some more historical and philosophical context for why it was written that way and what was trying to be accomplished with this. So I think the best way to do that is to kind of bring you back to Greek roots. And I think the best way to do that, I'm looking at notes on my phone right now, but I'll just go ahead and leave the screen here. If we think back to Socrates, he's perhaps the first major philosopher that we have recorded from the Greeks. He wrote a phenomenal text called Crito, in which he sort of made an argument for how humans conduct themselves through government. And this is, of course, you'll see the relevance of this as the dialogue progresses. He argued in Crito that human beings have this obligation to obey laws because laws are what determine our way of life. It's what allows the things that we do, our very existence, to be possible. Now, his student, and you probably have heard of him, is Plato. And Plato disagreed a lot, actually, with Socrates' ideas and principles. But the main one, of course, in this case, is that he thought that man's very nature contradicted what Socrates claimed as this overwhelming obligation to laws. Plato argued that men actually just want more than anything to commit injustices upon each other without reprisal, without any sort of consequence or punishment to come back to them. But they also want to not have any injustices done to them. So to avoid these two extremes, they created something called justice. And justice is the result of laws that and covenants that men make with each other to prevent these two extremes from happening. But it's more than just that. It's not just about, we obey the law so that everyone else has to obey it too. It's also about this reciprocal obedience. But he thinks that there has to be some sort of state, that there's this natural state that men always find themselves in relation to each other and relation to the law. Well, it wasn't until the early 17th century, the 1610s, 1620s, that a lot of philosophical thought was rekindled as a result of the epoch-defining age of the scientific revolution. So before the scientific revolution, the ideas of man's behavior and nature were really summarized in terms of religious or spiritual beliefs and ideologies. But the scientific revolution changed all that. It changed the way people thought about the universe. Before, it was conducted in supernatural terms, but now that we could measure and define things mathematically and scientifically, perhaps you could do that with other things as well. And Thomas Hobbes, around the 1610s, did this in his groundbreaking work, Leviathan. And in Leviathan, he argues that if we can define all things in nature and in the universe through science, well, so too can we with human nature. And that's what he tried to do. He tried to figure out if there was a way to define humans at their natural state. And he argued that all humans are naturally self-interested, that humans only care for themselves. But the problem is, and this is the caveat, is that even though we only care for ourselves, we are still social creatures. And because we are social creatures, we are willing to submit ourselves to some central sovereign authority to be able to live in peace and be able to conduct ourselves with our own interests. But the only way that he said we could argue for this is we'd have to imagine men without laws. What would men look like without laws? And he calls this the state of nature. And another philosopher in Britain around the same time wrote a series of treatises of government where he expands on Thomas Hobbes' ideas. And this philosopher was John Locke. Now, Locke tried arguing first one principal thing. Besides thinking about men's state of nature, which he largely agreed with Thomas Hobbes on this state of nature that it must exist, he sought out to argue that power is not housed in any one person or any group of people. It is equally distributed among men, so that no man can rule over another. He argued this first based on his religious beliefs. Now, in England at the time, the overwhelming religious ideology was based in the Catholic Church, Catholicism, which reflected very nicely the power structure of the monarchy. Just like a monarchy has kings, an upper class with nobles and serfs, and under that the knights, and under that peasants and the lower class. The Catholic Church mimics that a lot. You had God, of course, as the highest authority, the Pope, saints, bishops, cardinals, praetors, ministers, priests, nuns, and then, of course, the lower class. And there's many more categories in between them, but we still have all of this to consider. But Locke was coming from a Christian background, not a Catholic background. And in the Christian faith, they believe in a central, of course, authority in God, but that everyone else is underneath him equally, and that they have a direct line to God rather than having to confess their sins to a priest, for instance, or that the priest is a mediator between the people and God, so that there is no direct access there. This is an important idea because it would also influence, just as the monarchy reflects the Catholic Church, Locke's faith and religious ideology would then mimic his choice in the kind of government that ought to be ideal for mankind. So he argued this, again, from a religious standpoint. He began first by arguing that God first has omnipotence. He is all-powerful. So that's what he argues. He then says when he created Adam, he must have, if at all, given power to Adam. Now, if God did not give any sort of power upon Adam to rule, for instance, then no man has the right to rule, and the case is closed. We can conclude that no man can rule over another. But say, God did pass down power to Adam. If that was the case, then it is possible that Adam is the supreme ruler over the earth. But suppose he couldn't pass down that power. So if Adam died, that means that power, it cannot be bestowed, and therefore no one possesses that power to rule over anyone else anymore. Case closed. We arrive at the original conclusion. But if that's not the case, let's say he can pass it down to his siblings. Well, that presents several dilemmas in itself. For one thing, how would we know when that power is bestowed? Is it bestowed upon conception of the child? And if that's the case, is the child have authority over his own father? Or is it passed down at a certain age? Which of the siblings would receive that power? If it was all of the siblings or all of his offspring simultaneously, well, then they would have equal power. And if that pattern continued, well, then we would obviously assume that all men have equal power. So then that would arrive again at an original conclusion that no man can rule over another. But say, that it was passed down from child to child to child, one child having all that power, well, then that would mean that we would have to somehow determine the line of Adam, which is not possible. Which again leaves us at the final conclusion that no man should be able to rule over another. It puts all men equal. And that's what Locke concludes in his first treatise of government. But in his second treatise, he arrives at a more important, I think, conclusion, and that is that in this state of nature, where men have no government, they simply are one with nature, they must coordinate together in order to achieve anything. By themselves, sure, they may have lots of freedom, and by freedom, we need to be careful here. Freedom here does not mean the ability to do whatever we want. For example, and I'll use a silly example, if I want to fly, for instance, and I'm in this state of nature, that's not possible. I do not have the ability to fly. I have the ability to climb up a steep ledge or mountain and jump off of that ledge, and I will fall, but that's not flying. So I don't have that ability because there are limitations to physical properties of the universe. But I'm also not just limited physically, I'm limited emotionally. I can't just be sad and angry or happy at will. Those are actually reactions to external stimuli. So I'm actually limited in physical and emotional senses. But one could also argue I'm limited spiritually. All of these limitations aside, freedom is kind of complicated then. It's not about being able to do whatever we want. That's not the right definition of freedom. Perhaps then the best definition of freedom is being able to do what we want within the natural limitations of our realities, whether those are physical realities, emotional realities, and spiritual realities. That said, even if I had those freedoms, whatever, barring any limitations, that's okay when I'm alone. But as an inherently social being, humans need company. They need companionship. So if I were to interact with another creature, for instance, another person, even though we share the same freedoms, that is also limited by the availability of resources. One simple resource is food, for instance. But say there's a limited number or amount of food available, and my freedom perhaps includes being able to gorge myself on whatever items I see. But if that is my right and my freedom, what happens then to the same freedom of another person who also has the same right to gorge themselves on whatever items? Certainly at one point, one of us will be infringing and encroaching on the other's right to that source. So then freedom here eventually becomes a matter not of being able to do whatever we want under certain limitations. It's actually being able to give up certain rights to retain others. And so I and this other person have to reach an agreement that I will not take his food and he will not take my food, or that we agree to work together to collect food to share. But we call this agreement a social contract. And that, according to Locke, is where all government arose. That all people in a shared group decided to give up certain rights to be able to keep others for the preservation not of the self, as the state of nature would allow, but the preservation of all lives. And this is important then when we think of the Declaration of Independence, because it argues for its own definition of freedom, and it establishes examples of oppression. And what I think you'll find in this course is that freedom and oppression are actually moving targets. They are defined by the cultures and cultural phenomena that surround them. I'm having you read the Declaration of Independence because it is arguably the first written social contract of this country. And you can have a sense of the agreements that we come up with as a result, and how those agreements have changed over time and how we interpret those agreements. That said, and I think I've given you enough context, I think, for reading the Declaration of Independence. All the materials you can find for the Declaration of Independence can be found in this folder. I've created a link to the Declaration of Independence. It's a simple website that has the HTML format of it. I have the instructions for the upcoming summary response essay, which is due the 31st. That's a week from Wednesday. And then I have the rubric, the criteria by which I will be grading that summary response essay. And of course, the week 2 discussion forum. A note on the forum, I do want to say that I always post, or the due dates for the postings are always Wednesday and Saturday. Wednesday is when you need to post to the questions that I have. So your first post to the questions. And then you have until Saturday to reply to other people. Now, I give 100s to students who discuss. And by that I mean finding someone with whom you want to have a discussion. So you need 4 posts total. That includes, so 1 is going to be your original post. The other 3 can be replies to other people. But to get 100, you would need to have 3 responses, ideally to the same person, back and forth. Because if you reply to 3 different people, that's not really discussion. You could essentially be saying very similar things to each person. And I don't think there's anything being gained from that. So if you want to achieve the most points, you can still get a 90 by doing what I ask, but to actually get 100, you need to show me that you're discussing something. So if you go to the week 2 discussion folder, obviously here you can see different people have posted already. You'll have to create a thread, and of course you won't be able to see anybody based on the way I've set up discussion board, but I can because I'm the instructor. But you'll have to create a thread. The questions will appear here at the top for you. You'll give yourself a title. Obviously, the title should reflect whatever it is that you want to say in your post. You should number your responses so that your peers know what you're responding to. So 1 would be your first response, whatever you want to say there. 2 would be to the second question. 3rd would be to the next question. And then, of course, you would submit and post that way. Okay. Now, once you do that, your post will appear here along with other threads that you see. So let's say I'm going to go to Cynthia's thread here. If I go to her thread and I say, well, I've read her thread and I like what she had to say, I'll reply. So there's a reply button. You can reply to her. But if you want to know when she replies back, there is an option to subscribe to this thread in particular. And so rather than having to check Blackboard and discussion board every few hours to see if someone's done anything to it, you can instead just hit subscribe. And when you subscribe, you will receive email notifications anytime anyone posts to that thread, to Cynthia's thread. I disabled the option to subscribe to the whole forum because that means then you'd get, an email every time someone posted to the whole forum, and I don't think you want to do that. That would be a lot of unnecessary emails. So I've enabled subscriptions to threads so that way you can be on top of things and you don't have to regularly check Blackboard. You can simply receive notifications about when someone posted. Okay. Now, if you have any more questions, feel free to email me, text me, and I will obviously be here on Fridays for Blackboard Collaborates. If you need to meet with me between 11 and 1 on Friday, that's fine. You can also call me, but if you do decide to call me, I ask that you set up an appointment first to make sure that I'm available and I can take your call. You can do that by texting me, asking if I'm free, or emailing me and setting up an appointment more formally, and that's fine. I do ask that when you contact me, please let me know what section you're in so that I know how to find your information and organize things appropriately. Okay. I'll see you all on Friday if you decide to come. If not, be on the lookout for more integrity lectures like this one.